This gun lights your firemen, the pilot lights out.
This football team is coming into our place. We're standing in our way.
This is a game of the heart. Focus and finish.
Wow. Woke up this morning and my inbox was violated with Aaron Rodgers owners in playoff contention who clearly didn't sleep last night and were in a cold sweat looking for help. I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. Now, at the moment, initial tests show a small fracture in Rodgers' collarbone, and it looks like he's going to miss about 3 weeks. He's going to have more tests later today. So if you're in doomsday mode, let's take a look at what your options are if you don't have a capable backup. Who's the guy that everyone's coveting here? Let's take a look. We spoke about the fantasy herd mentality before. It's when people tend to flock to a guy after he's had a good week. And after last week's performance against the Raiders, you gotta believe people are gonna flock to add Nick Foles. Although he hasn't officially been named the starter for Week 10 against the Packers, he was still taking first-team reps yesterday, and he's expected to do so again today, as it doesn't look like Vic's ready to go. Now, the Packers' defense is far from elite, allowing more than 250 yards per game in the air to its opponents. And as a point of reference, last night's Bears backup quarterback Josh McCown threw for 272 yards and 2 TDs with no interceptions, good for 20 fantasy points. Andy Dalton isn't someone that's universally owned, mostly because people weren't universally sold on his 3-game stretch of success. He did have a setback last week throwing 3 interceptions, but I view his down week differently than most. To me, at least one of the INTs clearly wasn't his fault, and in my eyes, there were really 2 with blood on the hands of the receivers. And without those interceptions, his fantasy totals would likely have stood out for a 4th week in a row. Dalton now has 4 straight 300-yard passing games, averaging over 39 pass attempts and 343 yards during the stretch. And the most important thing here is that you know he's going to give you the opportunity for fantasy points because you know he's going to throw the ball. Dalton and the Bengals take on the 3-5 Ravens on Sunday in Baltimore. You know, people laughed at me when I suggested rostering Mike Glennon after his first start 5 weeks ago. But since then, he's tossed 7 touchdowns and just 1 INT, consistently putting up more than 15 fantasy points each and every week, with 2 15s, a 17, and an 18. Tampa plays Miami this week, who is 11th worst against the pass, allowing over 252 yards per game through the air. Newly minted Super Bowl MVP Joe Flacco is someone else you have to consider at this point. If you missed yesterday's segment on players to avoid, check this out. Ray Rice and his handcuffed Bernard Pierce are playing like they're handcuffed, together. Look, I don't care whose fault it is, if it's the offensive lines, if it's the running backs. In fantasy, we don't care why a player doesn't perform, we just want to avoid him if we know he's not going to. Rice had 11 carries for 17 yards yesterday, and one of them went for 5 yards, which means that his other 10 carries went for 12 yards. On the season, he has 97 carries for just 259 yards at 2.7 yards per carry. Bernard Pierce has the same stats virtually, 85 carries for 230 yards. That's 2.7 yards per carry too. Pierce had 6 carries for 11 yards and 1 went for 7 yesterday. That means his other 5 carries went for 4 yards. Not good. The Ravens are 3-5 and their margin for error in reaching the playoffs is razor thin at this point. Given the fact that they can't run the ball, don't be surprised if they start to open things up and let Flacco throw the ball more than usual. This is one of the stealthy plays that I'm pretty certain those not watching today aren't going to be thinking about. Flacco's viewed more as a good game quarterback than a good fantasy quarterback, so I doubt anyone else will be focusing in on him. And finally, Eli Manning is due. He's facing the Raiders this week, and we all saw what Nick Foles was able to do against them last week. Alright, I don't expect 7 touchdowns, but one of those 400-yard Manning games isn't out of the question. He's available in enough leagues to discuss him as an option here, and I would seriously consider him if he's available in your league. Today's Twitter question comes from @HalfBaked, who says that he's playing an Aaron Rodgers quarterback team in Week 10, and he's 1 spot ahead of his competitor on the waiver claim list. He wants to know if you should try to grab the quarterback that guy's going to try to get. I don't know that cock blocking works in this instance. You just got to play your own game and go with it. It's not like there's a definite no-brainer. He'd be had it on somebody's roster already. If you have a question you want answered, hit me up with a tweet, and if I don't use your question on the program, I'll tweet you back with my best advice. And be sure to tune into the Roto Experts Fantasy Football News, Notes, and Analysis segment every weekday. I'll be here to keep you current and ahead of the competition. And on weekends, come back for This Week in Fantasy Football as I team up with the King, Scott Engel, covering the week that was, the week that will be, and answering your viewer questions. For Roto Experts, I'm Mike Cardano.